Tales of Venison Jack, Part 2. The Archery Contest. Being taxed and exploited by rapacious foreign overlords is never a pleasant experience. The inhabitants of Waldenham had paid the rents and fees imposed on them by the lord of the manor, the Norman, Robert Sonk-Su, on Midsummer Day, and now they were feeling poor and miserable. They needed something cheap and diverting to cheer themselves up, and decided to have an archery contest. An archery target was accordingly set up in the meadow by the river, and the villagers congregated around it. There was Wilfrid with his bow, Olwyn with his staff, and Erwin with his pitchfork. There was Lambert the carpenter with his axe, and old Maud with her sewing. Finally, there was Ermengarde, who was widely regarded as the most attractive young woman in the village, although it has to be said that she did not have much in the way of competition. She was something of a flirt, and had promised to kiss the winner. A number of the outlaws put in an appearance. Venison Jack, Gilbert Goosefeather, and Plodding Peter all intended to compete. The butcher did not. He mingled with the spectators, in particular Lambert, who had brought along a large jug of beer. Someone who was notably absent was Egbert. Once upon a time he had been the Thane of Waldenham, but those days were long gone. His lands were now reduced to a small farm on the outskirts of the village, from which he and his family scratched a precarious existence. Bitter and embarrassed, Egbert kept himself to himself. But his younger son, Edmund, had turned up, keen to try his luck at shooting at the mark, and maybe win a kiss from Ermengarde. Everyone was relaxed, drinking, joking, and laughing, but all that changed when some uninvited guests arrived. Robert Sonk-Su came riding out of Mistletoe Wood. Alongside him was his cousin, Black Hubert, and marching behind them were 3 men-at-arms, the crossbow-toting Richard, and 2 spearmen, Rolf and Geoffrey. Out of the forest rode the Normans, down to the river-bank, and then over the bridge into the archery meadow. Here they halted, all except for the crossbowman Richard, who announced his intention of participating in the contest. He strolled over to the other competitors, who, silent and sullen, shuffled aside so he could take a place among them. The entrants drew lots to determine the order in which they would shoot. Each of them would loose 3 arrows at the target, which had an outer ring and a bull's-eye. First to the mark was Plodding Peter. His first 2 arrows missed the target altogether, but he found the outer ring with his third. Next came Wilfrid. He also only managed to hit the target once, again in the outer ring. And now Richard stepped up. His first bolt missed the target. The spectators smiled. But his next 2 bolts both embedded themselves into the bull's-eye. The spectators scowled and muttered that shooting a crossbow was easy, and that using such an infernal implement in an archery contest was tantamount to sharp practice. Venison Jack was next. He did no better than Peter and Wilfrid. Gilbert Goosefeather raised everybody's spirits by hitting the bull's-eye with his very first arrow. This caused Ermengarde to clap her hands in glee. But after that strong start, Gilbert lost his composure. His next 2 arrows went wide. That left Edmund. He could only manage 1 hit in the outer ring and 2 misses. And that was that. Richard was the winner. At this point, Ermengarde turned on her heel and headed for home. As she put it to Maud, she had no intention of hanging around to kiss a dirty Norman cheat. Robert Sonk-Su turned to his cousin. "We have let them have their fun," he said. "Now let us get to business." The business Robert had in mind was the arrest of Venison Jack, and he put this in hand by riding over to that gentleman and viciously striking him on the temple with the pommel of his sword. Venison Jack collapsed to the ground in a senseless heap. These events caused a considerable commotion. Gilbert Goosefeather, still bitter at the outcome of the archery contest, took advantage of the confusion to loose an arrow at Richard. His mood was not improved when his arrow went wide. Plodding Peter took the matter a step further, sidling up to Richard and sliding a knife up under his hauberk, deep into his groin. Black Hubert rode over to join his cousin, with Rolf following some distance behind. Geoffrey remained by the bridge to prevent anyone crossing over it and escaping into Mistletoe Wood. Most of the villagers decided that it was best not to get involved and started to head for home. But Lambert and the butcher, flushed with ale, thought that they would go and take a closer look at what was occurring and maybe lend a hand. Edmund and Wilfred fussed over Venison Jack's unconscious form, trying to bring him round. Hubert used the shaft of his spear to try and beat them back. There was a scuffle, which ended when Hubert dealt Edmund a resounding crack on the skull, knocking him senseless, and Robert swung his sword at Wilfred, forcing him to step away. Meanwhile, Richard was in trouble, bleeding heavily from the wound in his groin. He dropped his crossbow and drew his sword, lunging at Plodding Peter. As Peter dodged backward, Rolf came charging to Richard's assistance, stabbing at Peter with his spear. Richard was swaying, weak with loss of blood. Gilbert Goosefeather tried to finish the job, stabbing at Richard with his knife. But Richard was not going down that easily. Again he swung his sword, keeping Gilbert at a safe distance. Plodding Peter stabbed laboriously at Rolf with his knife, but Rolf stepped back and then counter-thrust with his spear, driving it into Peter's shoulder. Seeing Lambert and the butcher approaching, Robert called at them to keep their distance, and then reinforced his message by riding at them, sword in hand. The butcher decided that discretion was the greater part of valour, and made a hasty exit. But Lambert chose to stand his ground, waving his axe menacingly and shouting beery defiance. Wilfred tried again to come to Venison Jack's assistance. Black Hubert lost patience and started to use the sharp end of his spear. Wilfred quickly got out of the way, and with that the fight went out of the archers. They scattered and ran. But still Lambert confronted Robert Sonksue, flourishing his axe and making optimistic threats. The Norman was not impressed. Sneering, he struck Lambert across the face with the flat of his sword. Lambert reeled backward, considered his options, turned, and fled. That put an end to matters. Venison Jack and Edmund were bound and taken back to Robert's castle, where they were thrown in a dungeon, awaiting trial. Richard was also taken back to the castle, somewhat more tenderly, where he was laid in a bed and provided with what passed for medical attention. But it did him no good. Weak from loss of blood, his wounds became infected, and he was dead within a week. It just goes to show that cheats never prosper.